He had actually said it. My own son. After all these years, all the scraped-together sacrifices, after my very last $50,000, that was my severance. Get out. A brutal full stop to a lifetime of giving. A tremor still vibrated through me, not from the chill in the late autumn air, but from the ice in his voice. He had not seen the arthritic ache in my fingers as I had endorsed that check, the one representing decades of careful saving with Arthur, money earmarked for a rainy day that had become a torrential downpour of his own making. He had only seen the sum, a lifeline he felt entitled to. He certainly had no inkling that this lifeline was also a carefully laid line leading to a truth he had long hidden. Perhaps that makes me a monster, a mother setting a snare for her own child. Or perhaps, after 68 years on this earth, it simply made me a woman who had finally, irrevocably, had enough. The heavy oak door of his rented house, a house far grander than anything I could ever afford, slammed shut with a sound like a coffin lid. I stood there on the perfectly manicured lawn, the crisp, professionally edged grass, a stark contrast to the messy ruin he had made of his life, and by extension, mine. If you are listening to this story, thank you so much for being here. Let us know where you are joining us from in the world, and do not forget to subscribe to become part of our growing community. My name is Brenda Miller. I am a widow, 68 years old. My life, for the most part, has been unremarkable, the kind lived in quiet neighborhoods, marked by the changing seasons and the small milestones of an ordinary family. My husband Arthur was a good man, a steady man. We built a life together, not one of riches, but one rich in routine, in shared cups of coffee on the porch, in the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other without needing many words. We had one child, Gary, our Gary. From the moment he was born, he was the sun around which my world tilted. I remember the scraped knees, patched with a kiss and a colorful bandage, the school plays where I sat in the front row, beaming with a pride that felt as vast as the sky. I remember the dreams we had for him, Arthur and I. Simple dreams, a good education, a kind heart, a happy life. Arthur passed 10 years ago now, lung cancer, quick, brutal. It took the breath out of me along with him. After I downsized to a small bungalow on the other side of town, a place filled with Arthur's memory, in the scent of his old books I could not bear to part with, in the worn armchair he always favored. My days found a new rhythm, quieter, more solitary. My social security and Arthur's modest pension were enough for my needs. I am not a woman of expensive tastes. A good book, a well-tended little garden, a hot cup of tea, these were my small luxuries. But Gary was the recurring ache, the unfinished business of my life. The hopes I had held for him, the bright promise of his youth had slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, begun to tarnish. He grew into a young man, then a man, who was perpetually restless, always chasing the next big thing, the get-rich-quick scheme that was just around the corner. Innovate Solutions, he called his latest venture. It sounded impressive, modern. But like all the others, it seemed to be an innovation in how quickly it could devour money. His money, borrowed money, and increasingly, my money. Over the years I had helped. Of course I had helped. What mother would not? There were the temporary loans that were never repaid, the seed money for businesses that withered on the vine, the emergencies that seemed to strike him with an uncanny regularity. I had taken on part-time cleaning jobs after Arthur died, telling myself it was to keep busy, but knowing deep down it was to have a little extra for when Gary inevitably called. The trip to see the fall colors in Vermont, Arthur and I had always planned, postponed indefinitely. The art classes I had dreamed of taking, a forgotten wish. Each sacrifice was a small stone dropped into the well of maternal love, and I had begun to fear that well was running dry. Or worse, that it was bottomless and I was simply disappearing into it. My desire, especially in these later years, was not for him to repay the money. It was for peace, for a quiet acknowledgement that I had done my best, for him to stand on his own 2 feet, to be a good man, a man Arthur would have been proud of. Instead, my fear, a cold companion in the lonely hours of the night, was that I had failed. That my love, my willingness to help, had not been a support, but a crutch, enabling his irresponsibility, his descent into a version of himself I barely recognized. I feared he was a lost cause, and that my life's greatest maternal effort had been for naught. Gary lived in a newer part of town, a subdivision where all the houses looked vaguely the same, large and beige, with 2 car garages and lawns that screamed of professional landscaping services. It was a facade of success, I suspected, propped up by debt and desperation. He rarely visited my little bungalow. It was too small, too old, too reflective of a life he clearly disdained. When he did call or appear, it was usually with an air of harried importance, his conversation quickly circling to his latest financial crisis, his voice a blend of impatience and thinly veiled condescension. "Mom, you just do not understand modern business," he would say, waving a dismissive hand if I dared to offer a gentle suggestion based on Arthur's steady, conservative approach to finances. Then came the call about 3 weeks ago. Panic vibrated in his voice. "Mom, I am in serious trouble. Innovate Solutions? It is about to go under. I mean, completely. The creditors are calling nonstop. I could lose everything." He painted a dramatic picture of betrayal by a silent partner, of unforeseen market forces, of sheer bad luck. Never a word of his own misjudgments, his profligate spending, the whispers I had started to hear about his less than ethical practices. He needed $50,000. He said it like it was a sum I kept tucked under my mattress for just such an occasion. "It is my absolute last chance, Mom. This will fix everything. I swear it. I will pay you back, every cent, with interest." The old familiar promises, the well-rehearsed desperation. A cold dread settled in my heart. $50,000. That was the last of it. The very nest egg Arthur and I had so carefully built. The money we had earmarked for true emergencies, for our old age, for a comfort we hoped to share. This was Gary's emergency, a 5-alarm fire of his own making. My maternal instinct, that deep, primal urge to protect my child, warred with a weary, bone-deep cynicism. It felt like throwing a precious life raft to a man who would likely puncture it with a diamond pinky ring he could not afford. I told him I needed to think. "Think?" he had scoffed. "There is no time to think, Mom. I need it now." For 2 days, I wrestled with it. I walked through my little house, touching Arthur's things, asking his silent spirit for guidance. I looked at my bank balance, the numbers stark and unforgiving. Giving him this money would mean a significant change in my own circumstances, a paring down to the absolute bone, but the alternative, the image of him truly ruined, perhaps homeless. Even after everything, that was a hard picture to bear. Finally, with a heavy heart, I called him. "All right, Gary," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I will help you, one last time." The relief in his voice was palpable, quickly followed by an impatient, "Okay, great. Can you wire it today? I need it urgently." I told him I would get a cashier's check. It felt more tangible, more final. The drive to the bank was a blur of regret and a strange, nascent resolve I did not yet understand. The teller, a young woman with kind eyes, smiled politely as she processed the withdrawal. She had no idea she was handing over the last vestiges of my financial security, the culmination of a lifetime of careful stewardship. I drove to Gary's house, the envelope containing the check heavy on the passenger seat beside me. I had rehearsed a little speech. Something about this truly being the end of the bailouts, about him needing to take this chance seriously, to build something real, something honest. He met me at the door, his eyes darting to the envelope in my hand before they met mine. I started to speak, my carefully prepared words feeling foolish and inadequate. "Gary, He did not let me finish. He snatched the envelope from my hand, his fingers ripping it open with an unseemly haste. His eyes scanned the check. A flicker of something, triumph, relief, passing across his face. Then he looked at me, and his expression was one I will carry to my grave. A sneer, a cold, dismissive sneer. "About time, old woman," he said, his voice dripping with a contempt that struck me like a physical blow. "I was wondering how long you were going to make me wait." He stepped back, already turning away. "Now get out. I have important things to do. You are just in the way." And then the door slammed, leaving me on his perfect lawn with his perfect cruelty hanging in the air. Old woman, useless, a burden. After I had just handed him the last remnants of a life savings, the cruelty of it was a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. I stood there for a long moment, the shock slowly giving way to a pain so profound it was almost a relief. This was it then, the absolute end. But as I turned and walked towards my car, parked at the curb, a different kind of chill settled in. Not just the cold of despair, the raw agony of a mother's heart broken by her own child. Something else. Something resolute. A decision made long ago. A path I had set myself upon without fully understanding its destination. Now lay clear before me. He thought he was just taking money. He had no idea he was walking into a carefully set trap. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have turned your back long ago, or would that maternal cord, however frayed, still have pulled you in one last time? Whose side are you on at this moment? Let me know your thoughts. The drive back to my bungalow was made on autopilot. My hands gripped the steering wheel, white-knuckled, but my mind was surprisingly calm, almost detached. The silence in the car was a welcome respite from the storm of Gary's presence. When I arrived home, the little house felt different. Emptier, certainly, with the knowledge that the financial cushion Arthur and I had built was truly gone, but also quieter. The constant thrumming anxiety about Gary, the anticipation of his next demand, his next crisis, had subtly shifted. It was still there, but it was now accompanied by a grim sense of purpose. The immediate days that followed were an exercise in adjustment. I went through my monthly budget with a fine-tooth comb, making the necessary cuts. The premium cable channels I rarely watched anyway were the first to go. My grocery list became even more Spartan. These were small things, but they represented a tangible shift in my security. The emotional toll was harder to quantify. A profound loneliness settled in, the kind that seeps into your bones. I had always felt a little isolated after Arthur's passing, but Gary, for all his faults, had been a connection, a responsibility, a reason to, well, a reason. Now that connection felt irrevocably severed, not by distance, but by his deliberate cruelty. I found myself wandering through the rooms, picking up old photographs. Gary as a baby, all gummy smiles and innocent eyes. Gary on his first bicycle, a look of triumphant terror on his face. Gary graduating high school, a faint shadow of the man he would become already visible in the arrogant tilt of his chin. Where did it go wrong? I asked the silent images. Was it something I did? Something I failed to do? The questions circled endlessly, offering no comfort. I missed Arthur with an intensity that surprised me. I imagined his quiet strength, his pragmatic advice. He would have seen Gary's trajectory long before I allowed myself to, I suspect. He would have known what to do, or perhaps not. Perhaps he too would have been lost in the face of such callous disregard. The feeling of being undervalued, disrespected, forgotten. It was a bitter pill. For years, my life had revolved around Gary's needs. Now I was simply an old woman, discarded. But amidst the grief and the forced frugality, something else was stirring. The seed of a plan, a desperate last resort measure I had taken months, even years ago. It began not as a plan for revenge, but as a dawning, horrifying realization. It had started subtly, this unease about Gary's financial dealings. His businesses, always vaguely defined and perpetually on the brink of either massive success or total collapse, never quite added up. He would have these periods of inexplicable cash flow, flashing new gadgets or expensive dinners, quickly followed by even deeper troughs of debt and desperate pleas for help. Being a creature of habit and order myself, a bookkeeper by training in my younger years before I married Arthur, I noticed inconsistencies, vague answers to my gentle questions, financial reports that seemed more aspirational than factual. A few years back, after one of his early ventures had spectacularly imploded, Gary had stayed with me for about a month. He had been sullen, resentful, blaming everyone but himself. After he finally left in a huff to pursue a new opportunity, I was cleaning the spare room. Under the bed, tucked away as if forgotten, I found a cheap spiral notebook, a ledger. My blood ran cold as I flipped through the pages. It appeared to detail 2 sets of figures for a consulting gig he had briefly mentioned. One column showed modest payments received. The other, in a different ink, showed significantly larger sums, with cryptic notes beside them like cash, no trace, or off book. I felt a wave of nausea. What did this mean? Initially, I tried to dismiss it. Maybe I was misunderstanding. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. But the image of that ledger, the furtive way he had always been about his finances, it burrowed into my mind. Over the next couple of years, my observations became more focused, my casual listening more acute. During his rare visits, I noticed his increasingly shifty behavior when money was discussed. The way his eyes would not quite meet mine. The sudden acquisition of expensive items, even when he claimed to be broke. I am not a technologically savvy woman, but I taught myself to use the old desktop computer Arthur had bought. I started researching. Basic business practices first, then terms I had overheard him muttering during hushed, angry phone calls he thought I could not hear from the kitchen. Unreported cash, making it clean, shell company. The more I read about tax evasion, about money laundering, the sicker I felt. This was not just about a son who was bad with money. This was about a son who was, I feared, breaking the law. The shame was a physical weight. The fear for him was immense. But alongside it, a new, unfamiliar emotion began to bud. A cold, hard anger. Anger at his recklessness, his arrogance, his utter disregard for the consequences, not just for himself, but for those around him, including me. The true turning point, the moment my vague suspicions solidified into horrifying certainty, came about a year before he demanded the $50,000. Innovate Solutions was in its early, chaotic stages. Gary, with an audacity that still takes my breath away, asked me to co-sign a substantial business loan. He wanted to use my little bungalow, the only real asset I had left in the world, as collateral. My misgivings, no longer ignorable, were a clamor in my soul. I refused. Gently but firmly. The argument that followed was terrible. He accused me of not believing in him, of wanting him to fail, of being a bitter old woman. The words stung, but my resolve held. Later that week, I was searching for an old insurance policy for my house. Arthur had kept important papers in a sturdy, fireproof strongbox. As I rummaged through it, my fingers brushed against a manila envelope I did not recognize. It was tucked deep at the bottom. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled it out. Inside were documents, not just for Innovate Solutions, but for two other companies I had never even heard of, both now defunct according to the dates. There were bank statements showing large, inexplicable sums of money, moving rapidly between accounts, then vanishing. There were printouts of emails, terse and coded, discussing minimizing tax exposure and creative accounting in ways that sounded blatantly illegal to my untrained but increasingly educated ears. He must have hidden them there long ago during one of his stays and forgotten about them. Or perhaps, in his arrogance, he simply did not care. The proof was undeniable. My son, Gary, was not just a struggling entrepreneur. He was, by all appearances, a fraud, a common criminal in a slightly better suit. The weight of that knowledge was crushing. I spent weeks in a daze. Sleepless nights were filled with a silent, agonizing debate. Confront him? He would deny it, lie, turn it back on me. Go to the authorities? The thought of betraying my own son, of sending him to prison, was abhorrent. But the alternative, allowing him to continue, to dig himself deeper, to potentially drag me down with him if his schemes ever came to light and were traced back to my previous financial support, was equally unthinkable. It was then, in the depths of that despair, that the first tendrils of a terrible, necessary idea began to form. He would not stop on his own. He would not listen to me. The only way to make him face the reality of his actions, to perhaps force an intervention before he completely destroyed his life, and possibly the lives of others he might be defrauding, was to report him. This was not about revenge, not then. It was a desperate, painful act of what I could only describe as the toughest kind of love, a last-ditch effort to save him from himself. And, if I am truly honest, it was also about self-preservation. I could not let him ruin the final years of my life. Armed with this agonizing decision, I began to research, again on that old desktop computer, late at night when the world was asleep. How to report financial crimes. Anonymously. That was crucial. I could not bear the thought of him knowing, of facing his accusation. I found the IRS whistleblower office online. The forms, the instructions, they all seemed to swim before my eyes. It felt like walking through a nightmare. Meticulously, I compiled a package. I made photocopies of the documents from the strongbox on the library machine, my hands shaking so badly I had to redo several pages. I typed a letter, unsigned, on a library computer detailing my observations. Gary's pattern of failed businesses, his unexplained cash windfalls, his secretive nature, the specific details I had gleaned from the documents. I was careful not to reveal anything that could identify me as the source, focusing only on what I had found and objectively observed. I bought a money order for the postage from a pharmacy in a neighboring town. I wore a simple scarf over my hair and sunglasses, feeling like a character in a spy movie, though the reality was far more grim and pathetic. The act of mailing that package was one of the hardest things I have ever done. I stood before a blue USPS collection box on a busy street corner, the anonymous thick envelope clutched in my hand. For a moment, I almost turned back. This is my son, my only child. The words screamed in my head, but then a colder, clearer thought pushed through. This is wrong. He is hurting people. He needs to be stopped. I let the envelope drop. The metallic clang as it hit the bottom of the box sounded like a gavel, a judgment rendered. A profound sense of loneliness, of grim finality, washed over me. There was no going back. Months passed. Silence. I heard nothing. Not a whisper. Life continued on its altered course. I still saw Gary occasionally, though less frequently. His financial situation with Innovate Solutions was clearly deteriorating. His demands for small sums of money became more frequent, more insistent. Each interaction was a torment, knowing what I had done, wondering if anything would ever come of it. It was during this period of waiting, of observing his unchanged arrogance, his undiminished sense of entitlement, that the nature of my earlier decision began to subtly shift. The initial hope that an investigation might somehow scare him straight, force him to change his ways, began to fade. He seemed incapable of learning, incapable of honesty. And so, when he came to me with that final, desperate demand for $50,000, a part of me, the part that had seen the ledgers and the secret emails, the part that had mailed that anonymous package, knew something else. This was not just a bailout. This was bait. A large, sudden cash infusion into his failing, likely fraudulent enterprise. A sum of money I was almost certain he would not declare, that he would try to absorb into his murky financial streams without a trace. If an investigation was indeed underway, however slowly, however deeply buried in bureaucratic process, this $50,000 would be a bright red flag, a marker, a catalyst. It was a terrible gamble, my last significant asset. But as I stood there on his perfectly green lawn, with his cruel words carving new lines of pain into my heart, I knew it was a gamble I had to take. The pain of his rejection was immense, but beneath it, there was also the cold, hard knowledge that I had, perhaps, finally done something that might bring an end to his destructive charade. In the weeks that followed my expulsion from Gary's life, I tried to create a new routine. I started volunteering at the local library a couple of mornings a week, helping older patrons navigate the complexities of computers and the internet. A skill I had painstakingly taught myself, initially driven by the need to understand Gary's world. There was a quiet satisfaction in it, a small, tangible way of being useful, of connecting with people who offered a polite thank you, a shared smile. It was a world away from the fraught, demanding relationship I had with my son. I also started visiting Arthur's grave more regularly. I would sit on the small stone bench nearby, under the shade of an old maple tree, and talk to him. Not out loud, not usually, but in my heart. I told him about Gary, about the $50,000, about the terrible choice I had made. "Oh, Arthur," I'd think, tracing the carved letters of his name with my finger. "You would not believe what our Gary has become, or maybe you always knew." Maybe I was just too blind, too hopeful for too long. There was no answer, of course, just the rustle of leaves in the breeze, but there was a comfort in the ritual, in the feeling that I was not entirely alone with my burdens. About 2 months after I had given Gary the money, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was plain, cheap white paper, the kind you buy in a pack of 500. My address was typed, slightly crooked. There was no return address. My heart began to thump a slow, heavy beat against my ribs. I took it inside, my hands trembling slightly as I slid it open with a kitchen knife. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, equally cheap, folded in three. Typed on it, in a standard, unremarkable font, were a few brief sentences. Regarding your information submitted on, and here it listed the exact date I had mailed my anonymous package months prior. Further details on recent large cash transactions involving the subject could be pertinent. Any verifiable information on the source and disposition of sums exceeding $10,000 post, a date that was roughly a week after my tip-off, would be of interest. Do not reply to this address. We appreciate citizen cooperation. That was it. No letterhead, no signature, no official anything. But the specificity of it, the mention of my submission date, the focus on large cash transactions after that point, sent a jolt through me. The Internal Revenue Service. They had received my package. They were investigating. And the $50,000, they were noticing. It was working. My terrible, calculated gamble was working. A wave of chilling validation washed over me. The last stubborn vestiges of maternal guilt, the persistent nagging what-ifs, began to recede. They were replaced by a steely, almost frightening certainty. I had set events in motion that I could no longer control, nor did I want to. I had made the right, agonizing choice. In that moment, I consciously, deliberately, decided to sever the remaining emotional tethers to Gary's fate. He was on his own path now, a path he had chosen long ago. My role was over. My focus, from this point forward, had to be on salvaging what was left of my own life, on building some small measure of peace for myself. The next day, I signed up for a gentle yoga class at the senior center, something I had always dismissed as too frivolous, too Californian. It felt like a small act of rebellion, a quiet declaration of intent. Gary, of course, remained out of contact. I had no expectation otherwise. I did, however, run into Mrs. Henderson, Gary's former next-door neighbor, at the supermarket a few weeks later. She was a kind woman, but an incorrigible gossip. "Brenda, dear," she exclaimed, cornering me by the canned vegetables. "I saw Gary the other week, you know, flashing a bit of money around he was. Bought one of those enormous television sets, the kind that takes up half the wall. But then, just last week, I saw him again, and he looked like he had not slept in days. Stressed to the gills. Always was a strange one, that boy." She patted my arm sympathetically, blissfully unaware of the turmoil her words stirred in me. Flashing money, then stressed. The $50,000 was running out, or the net was tightening, or both. The local news website, which I had taken to checking with a morbid sort of diligence, ran a small, buried article about increased IRS scrutiny on small businesses in our state, particularly those with irregular cash flow patterns and a history of short-lived enterprises. No names were mentioned, of course, but every word felt like a direct message. The waiting became a heavy cloak, a constant low hum of anxiety mixed with a grim sort of anticipation. I imagined Gary's growing panic, his blustering denials to himself, his likely clumsy, desperate attempts to cover his tracks. I pictured him alone in that too large house, the walls closing in. I felt not sympathy, not anymore, but a bleak acknowledgement of an inevitable outcome. Then one rainy Tuesday evening, I was sorting through a box of old keepsakes, things I had not looked at in years. Mementos from my marriage to Arthur, his old service medals, some dried flowers from a long-ago anniversary. And at the bottom, a small, creased piece of construction paper. A Mother's Day card. Gary had made it for me when he was 7. To the bestest mom in the world, it read in shaky, oversized crayon letters. I love you, your son Gary. Below it, a crude drawing of two stick figures, one tall, one small, holding hands under a lopsided yellow sun. The sight of it, the innocent sentiment, the misspelled words, it undid me. A sob, raw and unexpected, tore from my throat. The weight of what I had done, what I had set in motion against my own child, the boy who had once written those words, crashed down on me with an almost physical force. Was this justice? Or was it a cold, calculated, unforgivable revenge for a lifetime of accumulated hurt and disappointment? The image of that little boy, his hand trustingly in mine, his eyes bright with an uncomplicated love, superimposed itself over the sneering face of the man who had taken my last $50,000 and told me to get out. What kind of mother does this? I whispered to the empty, silent room, the card trembling in my hand. What kind of monster have I become? The pain was a suffocating blanket, my carefully constructed resolve crumbling into a million pieces of doubt and self-loathing. I almost picked up the phone to call him, to warn him, to offer… What? Another chance to deceive me? Another lifeline he would misuse? Even in the depths of my despair, a part of me, the part that had seen the damning evidence in that strong box, knew it was too late, knew he would not change, knew he would only see it as weakness, another opportunity to exploit. A few days later, as if the universe itself were trying to answer my tormented questions, Mrs. Henderson called. Her voice was flustered, a little indignant. Brenda, you simply will not believe this. Gary Miller called me just now. He was asking if I had seen you, said he had some terribly important family papers he urgently needed you to sign. Something about an old investment of your Arthur's that had suddenly paid out a huge sum, and your signature was vital. He sounded like a con man on the television, all smooth and slippery. Said he could not reach you, that your line was always busy. When I told him I had not seen you much lately, and certainly knew nothing about any investments, he got quite short with me, almost rude, and then hung up. My blood ran cold. Arthur had no such investments left. We had cashed in everything of significance years ago, partly for Gary's earlier emergencies. Gary was lying. He was trying to use me, even indirectly through a gossipy former neighbor. Perhaps to create some sort of false paper trail, to hide assets, maybe even to implicate me in some way if things went truly bad. His audacity. His unyielding, grasping deceit, even now, when the walls were surely closing in on him. That phone call, that pathetic, desperate attempt at manipulation, it was like a splash of icy water on my face. It snapped me out of my agonizing spiral of guilt and doubt. The sweet, innocent boy who had drawn that Mother's Day card was long gone, perhaps had never truly existed outside of my own maternal hopes. The man he had become, the man who had just tried to use a kind elderly woman to further his own corrupt ends, that man was real, and he was unrepentant. My resolve returned, not with the cold, hard fury of before, but with a kind of bedrock certainty. It was no longer icy. It was simply firm. Grounded not in anger or even in a desire for revenge, but in a profound, sorrowful acknowledgement of the truth. I had done what I had to do, not out of hate, but out of a painful, unavoidable necessity. The path was set. My inner strength, which had faltered so badly, now reasserted itself, quieter, perhaps, but more deeply rooted. I would face what came next. The charade was over. My son, the man he had chosen to be, had made his choices, time and time again, and I, his mother, had finally, irrevocably, made mine. The silence from the authorities, from the world Gary inhabited, had been long and filled with a tense sort of quiet. But I sensed it was the quiet before a storm Gary himself had seeded, and I had merely ensured it was properly and thoroughly watered. Now all that was left was to wait for the thunder, and I knew, with a certainty that both chilled me to the bone and calmed my racing heart, that the tide was about to turn against Gary, dramatically. In the weeks that followed Gary's clumsy attempt to use Mrs. Henderson, I settled into a strange kind of limbo. My new routines, the library, the yoga class, my quiet evenings with a book, continued, but beneath the surface, there was an undeniable tension, an air of braced stillness. I found myself reading more, not for pleasure, but to fill the waiting hours. I tended my small container garden on the patio with an almost obsessive focus, nurturing the tiny tomato plants and herbs as if their survival was somehow tied to my own. I was preparing my spirit, shoring up my defenses for the news I knew must inevitably come. It arrived on a Tuesday morning. I rarely watch television in the daytime, preferring the quiet or the company of the radio, but that morning, for some reason, I had it on, tuned to a local news channel, the sound a low murmur in the background as I sipped my tea. Suddenly, a breaking news banner flashed across the screen, bold and urgent. The familiar face of a local reporter, a young woman named Sarah Jenkins, appeared. She was standing in front of Gary's Innovate Solutions office building. Yellow police tape, stark and official, was stretched across the entrance. My teacup rattled in its saucer. Local businessman Gary Miller, owner of Innovate Solutions, Sarah Jenkins announced, her voice earnest and grave, was taken into federal custody earlier today following an extensive investigation by the Internal Revenue Service into alleged tax fraud, money laundering, and several other serious financial irregularities. The camera panned to show IRS agents, stern-faced and carrying evidence boxes, exiting the building. The reporter went on to detail how a months-long complex investigation, originating from what sources called credible informant tips, had culminated in simultaneous raids on Miller's office and his rented home. She specifically mentioned that a significant, unrecorded cash transaction that occurred earlier in the year, believed to be in the tens of thousands of dollars, had apparently raised additional red flags and corroborated other evidence of illicit financial activities and attempts to conceal assets. My $50,000, my bait. Then Gary's face filled the screen. Not the confident, sneering man who had slammed his door on me, but a police mugshot. His eyes were wide, stunned, his usually meticulously styled hair disheveled. He looked haggard, defeated, a shadow of his former arrogance. I sank back into my old armchair, the remote control clattering unheeded to the floor. My breath caught in my chest. It was done. A wave of emotions, so powerful and conflicting they threatened to capsize me, washed through my system. There was a profound, aching sorrow for the little boy who had once drawn me misspelled cards, a child lost somewhere along the path to this public disgrace. There was a grim, undeniable sense of justice for the man who had treated me with such callous cruelty, who had exploited my love and trust for so long. And beneath it all, surging up like an unexpected tide, was a vast, hollowing relief. The terrible burden I had carried, the secret knowledge, the agonizing choices. It was over. The Kong Li Duk Thuk Tai Du Mang Nhu Ke Dang, as the old saying might go. Justice served, despite the bitterness of its taste. I did not weep, not then. I just sat there, in the quiet of my living room, the television babbling on, and breathed, slowly, deeply, in and out. The news report continued. Gary's defense attorney, a slick-looking man I had never seen before, had given a brief, non-committal statement. He alluded to complex financial arrangements and significant misunderstandings. He even hinted vaguely that Mr. Miller himself might have been misled by others close to him, who perhaps did not fully understand the intricacies of modern finance. The insinuation, though subtle, was clear enough to me. A desperate last-ditch attempt to deflect blame, to muddy the waters, perhaps even to cast suspicion in my direction, though it was too nebulous to have any real impact. It only served to confirm, with a final, sad certainty, the depths of his character, his inability to accept responsibility even at the very end. The days that followed were filled with more news. Gary's business, Innovate Solutions, was officially declared bankrupt, its assets frozen. His flashy rental house was seized. He faced a barrage of federal charges, carrying the threat of astronomical fines and, more significantly, the very real prospect of a long prison sentence. The local paper, which I usually only skimmed for the obituaries and gardening tips, ran a follow-up piece detailing the extent of his deceptions. It turned out he had not just been defrauding the government, he had cheated small local vendors, left employees with unpaid wages, and woven a tangled web of debt and broken promises throughout the community. His public disgrace was absolute and swift. I made a conscious decision then. I would not follow the trial, if there was one, or the subsequent sentencing, with any more than a detached, factual awareness. I asked my few friends at the library and the senior center, gently but firmly, to refrain from bringing it up in my presence. I needed to disconnect, to protect the fragile peace I was trying to build. I even changed my phone number, a small but significant step, to avoid any potential contact from his lawyers, his few remaining desperate associates, or even perhaps from him, should he ever find a way. The town gossip, as it always does, eventually moved on to newer scandals, fresher outrages. The yellow tape came down from the Innovate Solutions building. A for lease sign went up. Life, for most of the town, continued its familiar rhythm, but for me, Brenda Miller, a different kind of life, a quieter, more deliberate life, was tentatively beginning. 1 year later. It is a bright, warm morning in early autumn. I am in the community garden at the senior center, my hands comfortably covered in rich, dark soil. A genuine smile plays on my lips as I discuss the finer points of tomato blight prevention with Sarah, a woman I met in my yoga class who has become a good friend. There is an easy camaraderie between us, a shared pleasure in the simple act of coaxing life from the earth. My yoga practice has made me surprisingly limber for my age, and the quiet focus it demands has been a balm to my spirit. My little bungalow, once a place of quiet sorrow and anxious waiting, now has a different feel. On the walls, where before there were only faded photographs and empty spaces, now hang several of my own tentative, colorful watercolor paintings. Landscapes, mostly, of quiet country scenes, of the ocean at dawn. Places I have only visited in my imagination or in the pages of books until recently. After Gary's arrest, after the initial shockwaves had subsided, I finally enrolled in that art class I had dreamed of for so long. My teacher says I have a good eye for color. It brings me a quiet, unexpected joy. Last month, I did something I never thought I would do. I took a small group bus tour to see the autumn leaves in New England. It was something Arthur and I had always talked about, one of those someday plans that never materialized. Standing on a hillside in Vermont, the trees ablaze in a riot of red and gold and orange, I felt a sense of peace, of completion that I had not known in decades. I had reclaimed a small piece of my own worth, found an unexpected freedom from the crushing weight of Gary's expectations, his failures, his endless, draining dramas. My transformation is not a grand, dramatic affair. It is evident in the steady, quiet contentment of my daily existence, in the newfound lightness in my step, in the genuine smile that comes more easily to my lips. I did allow myself to see one brief, factual news alert online a few months after the bus tour. Gary, after a series of legal maneuverings, had pleaded guilty to several of the most serious charges to avoid a more prolonged and potentially even more damaging public trial. He was sentenced to a significant federal prison term, 7 years, with eligibility for parole after 5 if he behaved himself. He was also ordered to pay substantial restitution, though the report made it clear he had virtually nothing left to his name. His life as he had known it, the life of deceit and entitled arrogance, was over. The consequences, I thought, were severe, but they were undeniably fitting, a direct and unavoidable outcome of the choices he had made again and again over so many years. Now, this evening, I am sitting on my small, private patio, a fragrant cup of herbal tea warming my hands. The sun is beginning to set, painting the western sky in hues of soft lavender and rose. I watch the colors deepen, and my mind drifts back, as it sometimes does, to that awful day, standing on the curb outside Gary's house, his cruel, dismissive words echoing in the crisp air. "Get out," he had said, his face a mask of contempt. And I did. I think, a small, sad smile touching my lips. I got out. I got out from under the suffocating weight of his life, his constant demands, his betrayals, his deceptions. This old woman, as he had so contemptuously called me, found her way out. And in doing so, she found herself again. The pain of his betrayal is still there, of course. It is a scar, a permanent mark on my heart. But it no longer dictates my days. It no longer defines who I am. There is a terrible, unique pain in realizing that the child you loved, the child you raised and sacrificed for, has chosen such a dark and destructive path. For so many years, I believed that a mother's love meant endless patience, endless forgiveness, endless sacrifice. I thought it was my duty to keep trying, to keep hoping, to keep bailing him out, literally and figuratively. But I have learned through the bitterest of lessons that sometimes true love, love for yourself, and even in a strange and painful way, love for them, means stepping back. It means allowing the natural, inevitable consequences of their actions to unfold, however devastating those consequences may be. It was not about revenge, not really. Not in the end. Looking back, I see it more clearly now. It was about finding that critical point, that line in the sand where you finally stop setting yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, especially when they just use the light of your burning to guide their own path to further destruction. And perhaps the most important lesson of all is this: it is never too late. It is never too late to choose your own peace, to reclaim your own story, to find a measure of contentment, even if it means closing a chapter filled with more sorrow and disappointment than you ever thought you could bear. It is never too late to get out. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. It was a journey filled with difficult choices and a lot of heartache, but sharing it feels like another step towards healing. If this story resonated with you, if you felt Brenda's struggle or her eventual peace, please consider subscribing to our channel, giving this video a like, and leaving a comment below. I truly read and appreciate your thoughts and experiences. We have many more stories of resilience, justice, and personal journeys here, so please do explore them. Goodbye for now, and I sincerely hope to see you again in our next story.